morning. It's Monday, April 29th. I'm Senator Dick Black, and this is Focus on the News. We have, I think, a very important topic today. This is Ukraine's Frontline breaks at Ocheretyne. There's something that is happening in the Ukraine war that we don't know precisely how important it will be, but it could be very important. Now, it's too early to tell how significant the current break in the Ukrainian front line may become. But sooner or later, this is how the end will come to the Ukrainian war. At some point, the line will break. Ukraine will lack the reserves to shore up the breach. Russians will have ample reserves to exploit the break, and they will pour through, forcing a large retreat, and that will unravel other defenses, and the lines will collapse across a wide front. Now, if that collapse is sufficiently large, it could spell the end for Ukraine. Question is, could this be happening right now? A week ago, I observed an unexplained and unreported anomaly in the war maps. This just didn't look like the other Russian advances, which are occurring all along the line in various places. This one was an unusual 3-mile Russian thrust through the Ukrainian lines, a very deep, sudden penetration that was very narrow. It was mostly an unimpeded rush forward along a single road. Now, to me, the penetration looked narrow and dicey. The extended Russian forces were highly susceptible to being cut off by the Ukrainians. But over the next few days, I watched it carefully and noticed that the penetration grew wider. They enlarged the shoulders on both sides of that road. And eventually, Russian gains began darting out in other directions. They began advancing here and there from the initial thrust forward. Now, at this point, there are reports of villages falling to Russia. Semenovka, described as one of the main Ukrainian strongholds west of Avdiivka, has just fallen to Russian forces. This was just announced yesterday, I guess, or perhaps tonight by the Russian armed forces, which, by the way, Russia has been the Russian information has been extremely reliable throughout the war. Their approach seems to be, if there's bad news, minimize the reporting on it. But one way or the other, not to say things that are inaccurate. This is a different strategy than the Ukrainians have been following. And even the Ukrainian strategy has emerged from, it started off early in the war, they just would simply create imaginary events. Now they tend to be much more realistic, but in any event, when Russia reports an advance, it's usually a very conservative report. So Semenovka was announced as having just fallen to Russian forces. Now, earlier, the Ukrainian army announced that it had withdrawn from Berdichi, Novomykolaivka, and there are other towns in that area that are now being contested, being fought over. And the chances are that the Russians will capture those also. So this is not the usual situation where there is one particular village that is under assault. Now we see the collapse in an area. Now, I don't want to overstate this because right now, I don't think anybody entirely can grasp the magnitude of what is happening. It's clearly a very important event, but we don't know just how far this will go. Right now, there is no sign that the breakthrough is being effectively contained by Ukrainian forces. Wherever Ukraine moves troops to seal the breach, it forces them to create a new weak spot in the defenses that the Russian army can potentially exploit. And it's really just a question of how long Ukraine's luck can hold out, because the problem is that there simply are not enough troops to go around. Now, this particular battle over Ocheretyne, which was at the end of that 3-mile stretch of road, this all started when Ukraine ordered their 47th Brigade to withdraw. Now, the reason for the withdrawal, I suspect, was that the 47th Brigade was the brigade that was armed with American-made M1 tanks. Now, the M1 tank was supposedly an invincible tank, and it turned out that they were easily destroyed by very inexpensive drones that cost, hundreds or perhaps a couple $1,000s to produce. And these M1 tanks cost $10 million a copy. So the easy destruction of these supposedly invincible American-made tanks was a very bad look for NATO. And for that reason, it was imperative that they pull them out of frontline combat so that it would not, it just had a bad look, and they needed to get them out off the front. But the problem is that sometimes a relief in place is a tricky enterprise. And when the 115th Brigade came in to replace the 47th Brigade that was pulling out, the relief in place was very badly bungled. Nobody knows exactly what happened, but the Ukrainians simply abandoned many of their positions and left them unmanned. Suffice it to say, what happened is the Russians detected this, and they very quickly exploited the breach in the lines. They surged forward rapidly in a very decisive and professional fashion. That action allowed them to take a major part of the fortress town of Ocheretyne, and they then captured the high ground, and that opens up the area to other avenues of attack, which then took place. The Ukrainian high command was thrown into a panic. The 47th Brigade, which had been pulled out of the front line, was ordered to reverse their march and to fight their way back into the battle. Other poorly trained and poorly equipped forces were cobbled together to try and seal the breach. And to some extent, I think they've had some success, but not nearly what they would hope. At this point, the Russians are piling on. They're trying to enlarge the gap. They're sending in fresh, well-trained reserves and establishing supply routes to send in fuel, food, and munitions so that they can pursue this opportunity that they have and expand the attack and hopefully from their standpoint to enlarge this gap in the Ukrainian lines. The Ukrainian observers are furious. They're demanding action against whoever blundered, although it's unclear who that really may be. There's a Ukrainian analyst who first broke the story, goes by the name Deep State, and the analyst blames the commander of the 115th Brigade and reports that there were heavy Ukrainian losses as a result of this problem. He reported that everything was working smoothly under the previous brigade, the 47th, but then the 115th came in and, quote, some incomprehensible maneuvers on the part of the enemy began and the front line collapsed. This journalist reports that there are many social media reports about a lot of missing and dead soldiers of the 115th Brigade. It appears that the casualties are high on the Ukrainian side. Now, there are conflicting reports about who controls what, but the Russian flag is flying over Ocheretyne today. So it looks as though that very important stronghold is at least partially under Russian control, very likely to fall completely to Russia in the near term. Now, it's not the lack of weapons so much as the lack of manpower that is causing the Ukrainian defenses to fall. Things happen in war. Because it's a conflict, each side is trying to destroy the other, trying to confuse the other, and they do. And so, yes, there were mistakes made that shouldn't have been made on the Ukrainian side, but that is the nature of war. Mistakes happen. People walk into traps, all kinds of things. The problem is that for Ukraine, they have exhausted their reserves of manpower. In particular, when the United States planned the counterattack that Ukraine launched months and months ago, it was an utter failure, and it was a slaughterhouse. Ukrainian troops were just killed off by the thousands, and they effectively lost all of their reserves fighting this counterattack, this long-awaited counterattack that was going to somehow drive all the way to Crimea and perhaps thrust into Russia and maybe bring about the downfall of Putin. The whole thing was foolish. There were a lot of American generals involved in planning the attack. And the problem is that the American generals today really have no experience in high-intensity conflict. Their experience is based on fighting far inferior forces in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and they're accustomed to being just utterly dominant on the battlefield, fighting against people who are poorly armed, so the American generals have in their mind this picture of how things should work, and it doesn't work when you're fighting a very sophisticated, well-armed enemy like Russia. And so when we planned the attack for the Ukrainians, it was an utter disaster almost from the very moment that it, and so we started a lot of finger pointing. The Americans naturally didn't want to admit that their ideas were outdated, that they weren't up to date with modern realities of the battlefield. And so as a consequence, Ukraine lost a huge amount of manpower, and that void has caused this trembling all along the front lines for Ukraine. Now, meanwhile, as this very dramatic battle unfolds, the Biden White House is fiddling with silly things, hoping that they can keep Kiev afloat until after the presidential election in November. They do not want to have to explain to the United States public why they have embarked on yet another disastrous and economically draining war. So what they're doing, the latest shiny thing, this shiny object that they're chasing around, is that they have sat down and they are working out, on top of this 61 billion flood of money that we have just spent. They're working now on a 10-year financial and military aid deal that would force the American taxpayers to utterly exhaust themselves financially overseas while America's own borders remain undefended. Zelensky says that the deal, the 10-year aid deal, which some claim could amount to as much as $1 trillion, Zelensky said it should be truly exemplary and reflect the strength of American leadership. Well, I'm going to tell you, if we keep spending money like this that we do not have, that we have to print, one day American leadership is going to go up in a puff of smoke. It seems that Biden is determined to utterly bankrupt the United States before his term runs out. But one way or the other, it seems unlikely that Ukraine will remain standing by the time of the presidential election, meaning that the Democrats will have to explain why the United States forced another bloody and meaningless war on the American people and on the people of Ukraine. All right, well, thank you very much for being with me today. We hope that there will be some good news at some point, but in any event, we hope that you'll be back with us next Monday. This has been Focus on the News. Senator Black, retired senator, with you. I will see you on Monday.